Welcome to What's Your Story? Today, my guest is from Chicago. He's a native of Chicago. He is a historian. He is an expert on race relation. He is a business owner. He has done some acting. And just when you thought he had done it all, he's been a motivational speaker. He retired and became a school teacher. So please help me welcome native Chicago, Sylvester Boyd Jr. to the show. Sylvester, welcome.
Thank you. How are you?
I'm great. So Sylvester, tell our viewers a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm up in age a little bit. I was born, like you say, I'm a native of Chicago. I have a degree in both history and geography, and I've been fortunate enough to travel the world. I've gone from Denmark to Honolulu, from Honolulu to Venezuela, and many countries in between. I just got back just before the pandemic. I was in Cuba for a bit. So I've been very fortunate that way to see the world and then have an educational background in history and geography, which came in very handy.
So what I know a little bit about you is your family is from Mississippi. So how does your family get from Mississippi to Chicago?
Okay, I have a series of books called The Road from Money. And it's not money like cash money, it's the town's name. It's a little town in the Mississippi Delta, Money, Mississippi. And my folks are from there. Historically, what event took place in that town sparked the civil rights movement. It was before Martin Luther King, and it was before most of the major events of the civil rights movement. Emmett Till, a young African-American boy, I think of age 14, was killed. He came from Chicago on a visit to his folks in the South, and he was killed in Money, Mississippi. They say he whistled at a white woman, and his body was mutilated and thrown into the Tallahatchie River and tied down with a gin wheel and with barbed wire. It's sort of a gruesome thing, but this is part of real history, and I'm one for real history, not to cover it over and sugarcoat things.
And that was one of the things that I wanted to tie into this interview with them doing the miniseries on Emmett Till that's now airing this season on television. I was wanting to know the correlation of where Money, Mississippi is. So I know that it is in the Delta, and the spark during the Emmett Till era where he was brutally murdered. But was the reason that your family moved? And I know the South was the South, but the actual name, The Road to Money, the name of your book, was that, did they move for prosperity or did they move for a better life? What was the reason, and I know it was better life, but I just want our viewers to understand.
Well, number one, if you saw part of the series, you actually saw the gas station in Brian's store. I had relatives that actually worked there during that period of time. So it is very tied to my family. All of my family came from that little town in the Mississippi Delta. So I've heard about it all my life from my grandmother, my aunts, my uncle. They told me the reason that they left was pretty much the reason most African Americans left. The conditions in the South were abominable, and they heard of a better life north. So if they could leave, they left, and which you wouldn't blame them for. There was a story that was told that the Pullman porters would come from Chicago and drop off the Chicago Defender, and they would read it, and they would get all excited about things that were happening in the North. Of course, they were in the South where people were being lynched, people were being exploited for their labor, working in the cotton fields. In my book, you'll see my aunt, she picked cotton, my mother picked cotton, my grandmother picked cotton, and it was a exploitation of labor. And it didn't allow the young people to get an education. That's why we were behind in education. First, we weren't able to read. We were prohibited back in slavery time. Yeah, we weren't allowed to read. And then once we were allowed to read, if you had to work in the cotton field most of the day, you didn't get the education you should have gotten because you're too busy out picking cotton and being exploited. So that's sort of the real history of where things started with my family. They came north, came right here to 12th Street station, and they left the South, not all together. My uncle left first, and the way the system worked, Ben, the person that left first would usually come and establish sort of a beachhead for the rest of the family to follow. So we pretty much on that same pattern. I was amazed in the TV series on Channel 7, how closely that house looked like my aunt. It was like I was walking back in time. It was that close to the house I grew up in on 37th and Lake Park here in Chicago. The phone was even in the right place. The kitchen was in the right place. It was shocking to me how closely the producers did that. The Road for Money may be eventually tied to a TV series or stage play. That's where I'm going with this. But I have 4 books in the series, and 3 books have been published already. The 4th will be launched in the next couple of months. So it's very interesting. It takes you through the time from a Black perspective, a Black woman's perspective. My aunt was a very strong woman. She actually got some breaks in life. The reason she was able to purchase property in Chicago back in the 1940s is that her husband appeared to be white. Okay, so that gave her a foot up. He could purchase the property, and he died in the same year that Emmett Till was killed, 1955. And the property, of course, reverted to her. He bought an apartment building, and he was pretty smart. And so she had.
So Mr. Boyd, with that era, with your family moving, you know, we know the Great Depression had happened or was happening. That was when we know, if you know anything about history, know that the Great Migration, where all the Blacks started moving north, and Chicago was one of the places. At that time, you know, I heard you say your uncle moved first. Did your uncle have any education at that time? Did he read?
He could read. He was literate, but barely. Okay, that's where you found a lot of us. You know, he could read a newspaper, but not, you know, advanced education, of course, back then. And then you got to remember, this is the 1940s. She came to Chicago in 1937. Okay, and what was happening? Hitler was becoming strong. Here's a historical tie in Germany, and World War II came up, and that drew more Blacks from the South because there were good jobs. You know, we were at war, the country was at war, and the labor was needed, and the job paid pretty well relative to picking cotton, that's for sure. So that's a part of where they kind of tapped into what was going on internationally. And in another point, she was Rosie the Riveter in World War II. She actually worked here at Ford Motor Plant, was Chrysler back in that time, and building engines for bombers. So she actually contributed to the defense of the country. My uncle, he went to be in the Navy, which is something that most Blacks didn't join the Navy, but he was drafted into the Navy, and he was like a mess cook on the ship. And so he was sent to the South Pacific. So we contributed. And what I want to say, Blacks have contributed to this country tremendously. This country belongs to every Black person as much as it does every other person.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Mr. Boyd, what led you to write the book, or what inspired you to write the book to keep your family legacy, so that people would know your family legacy?
It's just one thing, the death of my aunt. I figured that story needed to be told. And nobody else in the family was writing. And so it was to be told, I had to tell it. And so that's what triggered the series. So, you know, I think a lot of most stories go unwritten. Everybody has a family, and I had a very strong family, fortunately. And I figured I needed to let the world know who she was and what she did. And you got to remember then too, in the 1940s, there were laws, restricted covenant, where a white person could not sell the property to a Black person in law, in the United States law. they were redlining. They would scare everybody out of a certain neighborhood, threatening that the Black people would come and cause the property values to drop. So she was in that atmosphere and did very well. I do say myself, she bought several buildings.
So I hear you say that your aunt bought the property in 1940. So I'm just trying to bring the eras together. So in 1940, when your aunt's husband, who, because I'm African-American, I know that you say that her husband bought it because he could pass as white. So we know that that is relevant in the Afro-American culture. But with the 1921, the Black Wall Street Massacre had just happened, 2 decades prior to that. Did that spike fear in your family? To try to, even though he could pass for white, he still had a family who were maybe not as light or could pass as well. Did he have a lot of fear for his family?
Well, the way it worked, he was mostly in the Black community. I mean, his home was located in the Black community. And so he was comfortable with the people around him. He didn't have a lot of, people that would be antagonistic immediately around him. But they talked about history. They talked about the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And they were very aware of it. It was things that they talked about around the kitchen table that we as Black people usually do, that stayed within the confines of a family. And how they felt about it was that I was always taught, if anyone else did something, I could do it. And that's from this aunt. She told me that. My grandmother would, matter of fact, I go back to Paul Reynolds, who you will see is one of the characters in my book. He was the patriarch of the family. And he goes back to just after slavery. And as a little boy, I remember maybe 6, 7 years old, I still remember him. And he would talk to the family about things that happened to him along the way. So the family and it was a strong family. My family was very deep. I was very blessed to have the family I had. And that's one of the things in the Black community today, that we don't have that deep bench of a family. You may have a grandmother sometime. I taught school, you may have a grandmother taking care of several kids because the dad is left at home or incarcerated or on drugs, or the mom's on drugs. And so I heard all those stories. And the fact that I had a deep family made me who I am today. Because if I didn't like what my grandmother said to me, I go to my mom, and if I didn't like that, I went to my aunt, and if I didn't like it, I went to my uncle. And so it was a whole team that formed a shield around me. And the kids don't have that shield today. And that's one of the things that I think that is very relevant to our culture today.
So that was going to be one of my questions was what something in the book is relative to the Black community. But would it be last year, 1921, being the 100th year of the Wall Street Massacre, the Black Wall Street Massacre, education played a big part in that, because a lot of those entrepreneurs were, not only were they wealthy, they were educated. And I know that, being an African-American culture, a lot of our people that came was not educated. And that is something that this platform, WYTV7, stands on, is education. So given that time, who was the educator of your family, and who inspired you to go on and get your education?
Well, the lady that I wrote the book about, she's one of the people. My grandmother, Julia, she only had about a 3rd grade education, could barely read. And she was one of the most intelligent people that I knew. But I had sense enough to listen to her. Her stories, she told me many times, those were selling in the book. I never thought at that time that I was a little boy, I never knew that I would be able to write a book. But listening to the people that came before you is very important. And I think that's another thing in our community. We don't the young kids do not listen to the older people, and the older people seem to be somewhat in fear of the younger people. That combination is a deadly combination. You have to know where you came from to know where you are and where you're going. So the people in my family, Then if my uncles, my aunts, my grandmother, I had cousins. I mean, it just went on. And they all came from the place in Mississippi, and where they ended up, most of them, most of them owned property. They came from the Mississippi Delta with not a lot of education. And boy, did they turn the world upside down as far as I'm concerned. But I had to be there to observe that. And the young kids now, you got to attach the train to the cars, the engine to the car. If you don't listen to what has happened in the past, because it would kind of predict what's going to happen in the future.
Absolutely. So, Mr. Boyd, we're going to take a break, and we'll be back for the second half to learn more about The Road to Money, a Black history novel that, you know, is a good read for anyone. So we'll be back right after the break.
80% of women will develop a pelvic health condition at some point in their lives. There is relief. There is hope. The Pelvic Floor Store, your resource for personal health.
Calling all HBCU alumni, supporters, and golfers. It's that time of year again. Yes, the HBCU Swing Into Their Dreams Charity Golf Tournament on Tuesday, April 5th. If you missed the last one, you have time once again to be epic. Don't miss the golf tournament of the year. The Swing Into Their Dreams HBCU Charity Golf Tournament at the Atlanta National Golf Club in Milton, Georgia, Tuesday, April the 5th. Registration begins now. Sign up your golf teams at swingintotheirdreams.com. That's swingintotheirdreams.com or call 770-686-7148. That's 770-686-7148. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to What's Your Story? Today, my guest is Sylvester Boyd Jr. He's a historian. He's an author. He's a substitute school teacher. Mr. Boyd has done it all. Today, he's on talking about his books, The Road to Money. It is a 4-part series. And we've been talking earlier about his background. So, Mr. Boyd, let's talk about the first book, Road to Money. And let our audience know where they can purchase it.
Okay, you can get my book at boydbooks.net, boydbooks.net, and it's also on Amazon. And this is a picture of the first book. And the first book goes from the year 1925 to the year 1937, and it is set in the South, in Money, Mississippi.
Okay, so Road to Money. So tell our audience who the book is about. What part of your family legacy did that consist of?
It is my mother's aunt. It is my aunt. It's my mother's sister, excuse me. It's my mother's sister, my aunt, who partially raised me. She was like my second mother. And this is a story of her life from 1925 to she passed away at the age of 91. So the books cover her lifetime. And the first book is set in the South, in Money, Mississippi, mule-drawn wagons, cotton fields. That's the kind of setting that it took. She wanted to get a better education, so she walked from Money, Mississippi to Greenwood, which is the nearest big town, had a better school there. So
I have a connection with Greenwood, Mississippi. My daughter is an educator. And so Greenwood, Mississippi was where she had her first teaching job. And so that's dear to my heart in the Delta, because that is where the civil rights movement really kicked off. So give our viewers a picture of what the scenery looked like back in the first book from 1925 to 1937, where what's discussed in your book.
Well, the setting would be a shotgun house. They call them shotgun houses. They were very flimsy. I remember them talking about, my grandmother talking about they had to put newspaper on the wall sometime to keep the air from coming through. But this wasn't all bad. They had Jew joints that nobody knew about, except the people in the area. My grandfather he had a still up in the woods, and he made his money off of, he picked cotton, but he had a little side thing that kept him kind of a little jingle of change in his pocket. So they did what they had to do. My grandmother talked about living off the fat of the land. That's what she used to call it. You know, they'd raise their garden, and they had their hogs, and they had their cow, and they would kill, you know, in the fall of the year. And they had the chicken, so they had fried chicken. So it wasn't all bad. Then they had field days where people from around the town would come, and everybody would do a potluck supper and pass the different dishes around. So they had that pies and cakes and just everything you could eat. So it wasn't all drudgery. So I didn't want my readers I wanted to give the story like it was given to me. But most of it was the oppression of white suppression in the South, where if you walked past a person who was a white person, you had to look down. You couldn't look in their face, and you had to walk. If they were coming toward you, you had to get off the sidewalk and give them space. So those indignities were daily indignities. As I told you, you couldn't drink out of certain water fountains in the South. Now, for me, being born in the North, never been to London, Mississippi, you know, this was fascinating when my grandma was telling me that. Like Emmett Till, I wanted to go south. They went south to visit relatives, and my mother told me, says, "What if a white person say something to you? What do you say to them? What do you call them? You have to say yes, sir, and no, sir." And I said, "Mama, I don't say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, to you. Say you can't go because you ain't ready for that." So it was just like Emmett. So it really crossed me because Emmett was 14 years old, and I was 12 years old in 1955. So it was really my story in a way. I didn't go south. He went south. And for fear of what happened to him, my folks would not let me go.
So you never got the opportunity to, because of the Emmett Till story. And I understand that being a mother, or, you know, any mother would understand that. And, you know, I think about how it's relevant to today. You know, you were saying about your mom was saying yes, sir, and no, sir. And it was the fear of the white people. So now we spring forward into the 22nd. So we're in the 23rd century here, which is 1922. Now, not 1922, 2022. I'm getting confused here. So 2022, we still have fear. So do you think we've progressed or we've regressed?
Well, the history of African Americans in America has been a step forward, 2 steps back, step forward, 2 steps back. It hasn't been a straight line, no up or down. It goes down and we make progress for a while. History is something that's always forgotten. People make mistakes, and the same mistakes are repeated. So the kids that are the young people nowadays, I've been in the classroom, they don't know about the struggle. They weren't part of the struggle. Unless they're taught, they will never know about the struggle. They don't have an interest in it. The generations before came from the South. They knew the indignities. There was a personal thing to them. Me being born in Chicago, I never had to walk on the other side of the street because a white person on the other side of the street. Personally, I have been able to be fortunate to live a life that most people never live. I've lived in an all Black situation. When I was young, it was in the South side of Chicago, it was all African American. Then my folks moved to 22nd Estate, which near Chinatown here in Chicago, still is to this day. And some of my best friends were Asian. There were also Puerto Ricans. There were Mexicans. I'll call it my little UN community. And then my folks moved to Allegan, Michigan. My stepfather built a house week to week. And when they moved in it, they didn't owe nobody nothing. And so that was, and they bought 40 acres of land in Michigan. That was the way.
So, and I don't mean to cut you off, Mr. Boyd, but I want to kind of say that because it's another question that I have. I kind of want to stay right there in this era of the 1925 37 era. So with you being a school teacher, do you feel like, and we're bringing it relevant to today, 2022, do you feel like the Black history is taught in the schools? With you being a school teacher, you can give us firsthand on that.
Well, I am no longer a school teacher. I was a substitute for 5 years in Chicago public school system. No, unequivocally no. History is not taught to white children, nor is it taught to anybody accurate history. The white population in America has a fear of real history. They don't want to tell young Black kids that we built the White House. Of course not. They don't want to tell young Black kids about Dory Miller at Pearl Harbor shot down more Japanese airplanes than anyone else. Of course not. He got the Silver Navy Cross, but he should have been given a Congressional Medal of Honor. This is history, and when you know it, you become, man, I can bristle my shoulders up and say, man, what a race I'm in. And you become proud of yourself. It gives you know who you are. I know who my people are. They're some of the strongest people ever. But if you're not taught that, you don't know that, and so you can't act accordingly. Our history, Joe Louis, if you go down the list, it's just a litany of folk. Malcolm X, I mean, the people who, Martin Luther King, I mean, the history is just full of Black people who have accomplished so much, and we built the country. Not only us, the Native Americans and the Spanish Americans and the Asian Americans. There's no group in this country that has not contributed to that flag. And there's no reason for anyone to wrap themselves. I see a lot of times on TV in current time, folks wrap themselves in, white people seem to wrap themselves in the flag. Hey, that flag belongs to everybody. It don't belong to you. And I will be the first to stand there and tell you that. And I'll tell you why. And, we were exploited for our labor. So if I pick the cotton and you get the benefit of it, you become rich and I just become another machine in the field. So, I mean, but we gotta let our young people know that. We gotta let them know who we are. I'm proud, one of my heroes is my grandmother, who had a 6th grade education and was, like I said, she's one of the most intelligent person I know. She used to say things like, if you plant a crooked seed, you'll get a crooked plant, which will bear crooked fruit. So she was smart. She was a philosopher. I would say that her knee, I was smart enough. I pat myself on the back, being smart enough to listen. And the young people have to learn to listen to the older people, because you're the future. You got years to live going forward. And those people have wisdom of the years, and they can give it to you if you listen to them.
Absolutely. So I hear you talk about, your history, your legacy, and how important that is. And that is something that our young people are missing, not because it's not taught in the school, because we know learning starts in the home, but we know that is something missing. So let's talk about your book 2. So book 2, Road to Money, the second book. So what era does that take place and what does that cover?
This book number 2 is 1937 to 1955. So it covers World War II. My aunt worked in the defense plant, Rosie the Riveter, again, contributing to the American war effort. My uncle served in the South Pacific in the Navy. So again, contributed to America. And we all got these stories. We fought in every war that America, from the Crispus Attucks, who was the first man to fall in the Revolutionary War. But our kids got to know that, and all the way up, every war we've had. My daughter is an officer in the Army. My baby daughter, she's retired now, but she was an officer in the Army. And she spent 22 years serving the country. So my question was, and my aunt used to always say, we love our country. The question is, does our country love us? It's not a matter.
Absolutely. That is so profound, Mr. Boyd, because Black America has contributed so much. So in your third book, what era does that cover?
The third book goes all the way.
And who's on the cover?
These oh, by the way, these are my daughters that are on the cover. So that's my daughter. And that's the third picture on the third book. And that book covers the year 1950s, the 1968, ends in 1968, which covers Martin Luther King's assassination as about where it ended. So each book picks up where the last book left off. And I wanted the series to be where you could read one book and enjoy it, or it could be connected to, and each book should be able to stand alone, so the story would be complete if you just bought one book. But when you put them in a group, you can see the pattern all the way through the years, the 40s, the 50s, the 30s, the 20s, and etc.
So, Mr. Boyd, this is our 7th season on WYTV7. So our campaign for 2022 is, what are you trying to do in 2022? So Sylvester Boyd Jr., tell our audience, what are you trying to do in 2022?
Well, in 2022, basically, I'm full of joy about, even with the pandemic, because I mean, you can't let things stop you. That's always the way I look. You do your best with the cards on the table. Sometimes you get a bunch of aces, and sometimes you don't. So you do the best, and I'm looking forward to making these books into a TV series or a play. I'm looking forward to going in once the pandemic kind of calm down, and we don't know when that would be, into going to schools and talking to young people about our history, who we are, what we contributed, and why they should be proud of who they are. Because once you get a sense of pride, ain't no turning you around. It's the people who feel like there's no tomorrow, that I can do anything today because tomorrow I might be here. The most frustrating thing when I was a teacher is for young people to tell me, I don't think I'm going to live to be 20. I could not imagine thinking that when I was a kid. I mean, why would I ever think that I wouldn't live to be 20? So it's a depression that sits into your young group, and they react from that. They feel that nobody cares about them. And then you look at the nightly news and you can kind of understand where some of that comes from. But I think it's a thing where the connection between adult and youth have been kind of broken in our community. And we have to get back to establishing that. When I was in class and a kid when I taught class and kid came, I was a substitute. When a kid came in, they seemed to be acting out. I would take them out in the hall and I said, okay, now give me the story. What's going on with you? That moment. And then I would say, I love you, number one. As a teacher, I would say, I love you. And that would kind of throw them off balance because they probably hadn't heard that before. So, the fact that I would say that, and then they would tell me, well, my dad was in jail, and so, my mom and dad beat mama, all these horror stories. And then believe it or not, those kids, the rest of the day, generally I had no trouble with it. It's because I kind of showed them that I cared about them. They weren't just somebody dumped in a classroom. So that kind of thing we got to get back to.
Absolutely. So, Mr. Boyd, I would like to thank you for coming on and sharing your story on What's Your Story. And I am so glad that you are trying to bring peace and share your legacy of the Black community, not with just the Black community, but with the world. So we will encourage people to go out and buy The Road to Money, the entire series. When will your 4th book be out? And we're going to have to close.
Okay, the 4th book will be out by March of this year. So you'll be able to get the entire series at boydbooks.net, boydbooks.net.
Well, Mr. Boyd, I'm Sharita Williams, and I'd like to thank you for being on What's Your Story. And we will go out and buy The Road to Money and hopefully see that in 2022 as a mini series as the Emmett Till story is. So I would like to thank you for coming on and spreading your legacy and letting your legacy live on, not in just speaking, but to be in a written word. So I would like to thank you for being on our show. Thank you very much. I'm Sharita Williams. What's Your Story?
Thank you for having me.